I'm going to talk housing and the Housing Australia Future Fund. Please be nicer to me in the comments than Labor was to Max Chandler Mather. I would probably cry if this was me.
This isn't student politics. Instead of hyperventilating like a debating team...
So Max, why are you and the Greens
blocking this bill?
Well, they're just not. This is a lie from the Labor Party, who are doing anything they can to avoid talking about their actual housing policy.
That axis of evil that we saw.
The Greens haven't blocked Labor's Housing Australia Future Fund, even if some of us might have liked them to. They've just deferred debate in the Senate until after the next National Cabinet meeting because the Greens' support for the bill depends on whether or not the government will coordinate with the states and territories at a National Cabinet level to stop unlimited rent increases. There is so much misinformation about what delaying this debate in the Senate actually means. So let's start with this one.
And it beggars belief, Mr. Speaker, that the Greens have teamed up with the Coalition to stop those tens of thousands of homes being built.
The Housing Australia Future Fund, being a future fund, doesn't actually spend a single cent on housing until the fund hopefully makes a return on investment in the next financial year. That's how the future fund model works, hence why it being labelled a $10 billion investment is also a lie.
Labor is threatening a double dissolution election as the Greens team up with the Coalition to block its signature $10 billion policy.
It's not a $10 billion investment on housing. That'd be great. It's a $10 billion investment in the stock market. Then the government uses any returns on that investment to build housing once they've siphoned off a cut for the fund managers, of course. So to say that delaying this bill until after National Cabinet meets is stopping housing going up right now is simply untrue. The HAF wouldn't be spending a cent on housing until 2024-25, even if it was passed through the Senate this week. What's actually happened during this whole debate is the opposite of blocking housing getting built, because these negotiations have already forced Labor to invest more in social housing than they would have spent through the HAF in 4 years. The Greens have been using the HAF to push for two things: rent controls and direct investment in public, social and affordable housing. And guess what Labor caved in on last week?
They've moved on quite a few issues in this housing space to try and win over the Greens, including, as you say, over the weekend, suddenly finding that extra $2 billion for social housing.
That's $2 billion of direct investment on the ground literally as of next week, more than the Housing Australia Future Fund would have produced over 4 years. That money wasn't announced in the budget. That money wasn't going to be spent if the Greens just waved through the HAF. That money had to be shaken out of Labor through negotiations on the Future Fund. To suggest that the Greens are stopping housing being built is the opposite of the truth. The Greens are the only reason there is any guaranteed funding at all. Now the criticism moves to, well, they got what they want, so it's time to fold.
There was some discussion within the Greens, I can tell you, ahead of this week starting, as to whether they just bank that victory and back the bill. They ultimately decided not to. They want to keep pushing for more.
Now, if you're down the political rabbit hole, maybe you think, yeah, it's probably reasonable for the Greens to bank that win and support the HAF now. But two things. First, that $2 billion direct investment isn't tied to the HAF at all. That's locked in, on the ground, ready to go, regardless of what happens to the HAF. And second of all, let's just look at the scale of the housing crisis for a second. There's a shortfall of between 500 and 700,000 social housing units in Australia, and that number is increasing pretty quickly. The HAF would spend $500 million annually, which is a drop in the ocean of what's needed, and that $2 billion direct investment, though positive, is only a one-off payment. That payment needs to at least be annual, not to fix the housing crisis, just to stop it getting worse. To me, that alone should justify holding out on the HAF until Labor comes back to the negotiating table. But let's talk about the other one of the Greens' demands.
Australia is a wealthy country. Australia is a country that is meant to pride itself on giving everyone the basics they need to live a good life. And that is why the Greens are fighting so hard. It was the Greens who stood up for months, being accused by the Labor Party of standing in the way. And actually what we did was secure $2 billion in funding for social housing. And now we are going to use that power to make sure those renters out there are able to live in dignity.
The Green support for the HAF predicates on whether the PM coordinates rent controls with the states. Something the PM has said is impossible and pixie dust.
Absolute pixie dust. Because that's what that is. That's what that is.
It's right to point out that residential tenancy laws are a matter for the states, but so are energy prices, which the PM coordinated freezes on with the states and territories through National Cabinet. He even brought back Parliament in the Christmas break for it. The arguments for and against rent controls are highly ideological, and you can find evidence to support both arguments. The long game isn't actually rent freezes though, it's rent controls. The Greens have been calling for a 2-year emergency rent freeze because rents have skyrocketed far beyond the inflation rate. But in the long term, the call from the left is to make unlimited rent increases illegal. This is already a thing in the ACT, where the Greens are in shared government with 3 seats at the cabinet table, including a Greens Attorney General, who has put caps on rent increases at 110% of inflation. That's not quite as tight as what the federal Greens are calling for. They want 2% every 2 years, but to land a deal on rent increases nationally would be of massive help to the 1 in 3 Aussies who are renting in this country. Now, the main argument against rent controls, apart from telling everyone you don't know what communism means, is that it will reduce supply as landlords leave the market. And to that, I say good, because we shouldn't be relying on private landlordism to provide affordable housing in this country. If a landlord sells their home and it's bought by a first home buyer, or the government buys it to turn it back into public housing, that's a good thing. That takes a renter off the market, as well as taking a house off a property speculator who is free to go and invest in anything else. At the end of the day, the housing crisis isn't going to be solved by Howard-era Liberal Treasurer Peter Costello's future fund model. Sure, it makes a return on investment most years, but has absolutely no transparency about what it invests in. It's full of jobs for mate-style fund manager appointees, and is such a small scale that the scheme won't build affordable housing as fast as the waiting list for them grows. If the Labor government is so attached to the future fund, fine. Create a $10 billion fund with it and put any profits that it makes back into the budget. But this isn't how you fund essential services. You wouldn't dream of funding healthcare or education through a future fund model, so let's not do it with housing either. We need annual direct investment, we need something for renters, and we need more discussion about housing policy, focusing on the scale of the issue, not whatever the hell Labor's been trying to do with these personal attacks and blatant lies over the last month.